There are buildings that sit on top of things the ground was not finished with, and the workhouse on the ridge above Balsam Creek was one of them. The county built it on a shelf of limestone in the southwest Virginia mountains, 14 miles from the county seat over a road that turned to mud in spring. For years it housed the people the county couldn't feed and didn't want to see. In the spring of 1897 the cellar floor cracked open, and the smell that came up told the county something beneath that building had been waiting. What they found down there, and what they couldn't find in the records when they went looking, is the story of how a man used the archive itself to make people disappear. Before we go any further, look in the description of this video and the pinned comment. There's a link there to something called the Appalachian Dossier, a collection of accounts quietly erased from official American records between 1843 and 1891. Go check it now or come back to it after. It's waiting for you. Now the workhouse. After Virginia's statute for religious freedom passed in 1785, the Anglican Church stopped being the body that handled poor relief, and county governments took over the job. They appointed men called overseers of the poor, and those men collected a poor tax and built places to put the people the county couldn't support. The places were called poorhouses, or almshouses, or workhouses, and they were built to be harsh on purpose. The idea was that if the building was made uncomfortable enough, anyone who could work would find a way to work rather than go there. Most of the people who ended up in them couldn't work at all. Balsam County built its workhouse in the 1872nd on a limestone ridge above a creek that fed into the New River. The building was 2 stories of stone, with a barracks wing, a kitchen, a root cellar, and a set of quarters for the superintendent and his wife. The county chose the site because the land was cheap and nobody wanted it for anything else. The ridge sat at the end of a road that wound through 9 miles of hollow and 5 miles of switchback before it reached the county seat, and that road was passable by wagon for maybe 7 months of the year. The rest of the time the workhouse was on its own. The geology mattered, though nobody in the county thought about it at the time. Southwest Virginia sits on karst terrain, limestone that water has been dissolving for thousands of years, and karst produces caves, sinkholes, and vertical shafts that can open without warning beneath anything built on top of them. The ridge above Balsam Creek was limestone all the way down, and the men who laid the workhouse foundation ran into a partially collapsed cave system when they dug the cellar. They built over it. They filled what they could with rubble and stone and poured a floor on top, and for 20 years the floor held. The county had other things to worry about. The county always had other things to worry about. The workhouse needed someone to run it, and in 1886 the Board of Supervisors found a man. His name was Harlan Voss. He was 44 years old when the county appointed him, tall and narrow through the chest, with a long, sunken face and deep-set eyes and a beard he kept trimmed close with a straight razor every Sunday, whether the building had hot water or not. His hands were large and knuckled, the hands of a man who had spent his younger years doing farm labor before he got the appointment, and they didn't quite uncurl all the way when they rested on a table. He had come from the eastern side of the state, from somewhere outside Petersburg, and he had no family in Balsam County. He had one connection. His cousin, a man named Aldous Voss, sat on the county board of supervisors, the body that approved overseer of the poor appointments. The county didn't advertise the position. The county didn't interview anyone else. Aldous recommended Harlan, and the board approved him in the same meeting, and Harlan Voss became the superintendent of the Balsam County Workhouse in the spring of 1886. He was quiet. The kind of quiet that made men stop talking when he walked into a room, not because he raised his voice, but because he never raised it. He spoke in a low, even tone that carried without effort, and the inmates learned quickly that the only way to tell when Voss was angry was that he got quieter, never louder. When his voice dropped to a certain pitch, someone was about to be punished. When his hands went still at his sides and stopped moving, The punishment was coming soon. He didn't drink. He didn't gamble. He didn't attend the circuit preacher services when the preacher came through, which was once every few months, and the preacher stopped coming to the workhouse after the second year because Voss told him the inmates weren't interested and he didn't need the visit. He ran the building with total control. The county sent money and supplies quarterly, and Voss sent back receipts and a brief count of inmates, and that was the extent of the county's knowledge of what happened inside the walls. No inspector came. The nearest doctor was 18 miles away through the hollow, and he came only when summoned, which Voss rarely did. The county had built a place to put people it didn't want to see, and it had hired a man to run it, and then the county looked away. That was the arrangement. It worked because nobody checked it. His wife, a woman named Cora, cooked for the inmates and kept the superintendent's quarters. She was thin and dark-haired, and she did not speak to the inmates unless she was handing them food or telling them where to carry something. She had been a schoolteacher before she married Voss, and the men who worked at the workhouse said she watched everything that happened in the yard from the kitchen window, and what she saw she told her husband. Voss had labor, isolation, and total authority. The county had given him all three. What he did with them is what the mountain eventually gave back. Most of the people at the Balsam County Workhouse were the expected sort. Old men and women with no family left, the sick, the mentally unfit, people who had nowhere else to go and nobody to say their name. They sat in the barracks wing and ate what Cora cooked and waited for whatever came next. The county knew they were there on the rolls, existing in the paper. But Voss also received young people. Boys and girls between 16 and 17 sent by county courts for vagrancy or petty theft or simply because nobody knew what else to do with them. In 1892nd Virginia, a 16-year-old could be apprenticed to a farmer or a tradesman, and the law preferred that to keeping them in a poorhouse. But some of them had nobody to apprentice them to, and some of them came from neighboring counties that didn't want to deal with the paperwork, and those ones stayed at the workhouse. They were the ones nobody claimed. They arrived in a wagon driven by a county official, sometimes with a commitment order on paper, and sometimes without. When the paper existed, it had a name and an age and a charge and a judge's signature. When it didn't, the young person existed only in the memory of the man who drove the wagon, and that man drove back down the mountain and forgot. Arlo Vance came in the spring of 1889. He was 17, dark-haired, quiet, with a scar across his left palm from a knife slip at a sawmill, where he'd worked briefly before the owner sent him away. His mother had died the previous winter, and there was no father. A county court, in the next jurisdiction over, committed him for vagrancy, which meant he had been caught walking on a road with no money and no destination, and the judge sent him to Balsam County because the workhouse there had room. The commitment order had his name and his age, and the word vagrancy, and nothing else. No one came to visit him. No one wrote letters asking where he went. He was the kind of young person whose absence wouldn't be noticed for months, if it was noticed at all. He wasn't the only one. Between 1889 and 1890, at least 6 young people between 16 and 17 arrived at the workhouse the same way Arlo did, carried up the mountain in a county wagon with a piece of paper or without one, and left behind at the stone building on the limestone ridge with a quiet man who never raised his voice and a wife who watched from the kitchen window. None of them had anyone coming to look for them. That was the thing they had in common, and it was the thing that made them useful to a man like Harlan Voss. What happened to them is what the mountain kept, and what the mountain kept it would give back. June of 1890 was census month. The 11th census of the United States, the first one to use Herman Hollerith's punch card tabulation system, the first one to be counted by machine. The federal government hired nearly 47,000 enumerators to walk every road in every county and write down every person they found, and the way they hired those enumerators was through political patronage. No examination. No test. A man got the job because someone in the party apparatus owed him or his family a favor, and that was enough. The census that year was mired in fraud from the start. In Minneapolis, businessmen were indicted for adding more than 1,100 phony names to the count. In New York, state officials were accused of inflating their numbers for political advantage. The system was built on trust, and the trust was thin. The enumerator for Balsam County's Mountain District was a farmer named Ward Pell. He was 40, broad-shouldered, not a bright man, but a loyal one, and he owed Aldous Voss, the superintendent's cousin on the board of supervisors, a favor that went back to a land dispute settled in Pell's favor 3 years earlier. When the census appointment came through, Pell understood where it came from. He understood what was expected. The way the census worked for an institution like a workhouse was simple. The enumerator treated the building as a single household. He walked in, sat down with the superintendent, and recorded everyone under that roof: the superintendent and his family, the hired hands, and the inmates. He wrote their names and ages and conditions on a single schedule, and when he was done, he carried that schedule with him to the next household. What he wrote, or what he chose not to write, became the only official record of who was inside those walls. Pell arrived at the workhouse on a Tuesday in early June. Voss met him at the gate. They spoke privately, away from the building, for maybe 20 minutes. What was said between them isn't recorded anywhere. But what Pell wrote on the census schedule shows what was decided. The schedule for the Balsam County Workhouse listed Harlan Voss, his wife Cora, 2 hired farmhands named Judson Creel and Matthew Warr, and 11 elderly or disabled inmates. It listed their names and ages and conditions in careful handwriting. What it didn't list was the 6 young people between 16 and 17 who were living and working at the workhouse at that moment. Arlo Vance wasn't on the schedule. None of them were. Pell's pen had passed over them the way a hand passes over a blank space, pressed on a form, and they ceased to exist in the federal record. The thing that made this erasure permanent was a decision made 3 years before the census takers walked their routes. Unlike every census from 1790 through 1880, which required copies to be filed in county clerk's offices, the 1890 census sent the original and only copies straight to Washington. No local backup. No duplicate sitting in a courthouse where anyone could check it. What Ward Pell wrote on that schedule in the mountains of Balsam County was the only version that would ever exist. And when he rode away from the workhouse gate that Tuesday, the young people inside it had no official existence. Before we go any further, I should tell you something. This story is being told to you by the fear behind you. If you've made it this far without subscribing, tap that button now. And if you're hearing this on a channel that isn't ours, someone has taken our work without permission. Report it for us. Now, back to the ridge. The young people at the Balsam County Workhouse worked. That was the arrangement the county intended when it built the place, and Voss enforced it with the precision of a man who had been doing farm labor since he could hold a hoe. The work began before dawn and ended after dark. They cleared land, breaking rock on the ridge to expand the garden plot. They carried water from a spring a quarter-mile downhill, 2 buckets at a time, 4 trips before breakfast. They tended crops on the thin mountain soil that produced more rocks than food, and they repaired fences and split wood, and did whatever else Voss told them to do, and they did it without speaking unless spoken to. Because the superintendent's quiet was contagious, and his anger was worse than his quiet. The pattern that emerged over the following years was simple enough that the elderly inmates understood it without being told. A young person arrived. They worked. And then one morning they were gone from the barracks wing, and their place at the work table was empty, and Voss would tell the others that the young one had been apprenticed to a farmer in the valley or sent back to their home county. No farmer came to collect them, no wagon arrived from the valley. The young person simply stopped being there, and after a few days the other inmates stopped looking at the empty place, because looking at it and asking about it was the kind of thing that made Voss's hands go still at his sides. Arlo Vance stopped appearing at the work table in the late summer of 1890. He had been at the workhouse for a little over a year. Voss told the elderly inmates that the boy had been apprenticed to a farmer near the county seat, and that the arrangements had been made quietly. There was no farmer. There was no arrangement. Arlo Vance, 17 years old, with dark hair and a scar across his left palm, who had no family and no census record, and no one in any county who knew his name, ceased to exist in every way that the world keeps track of a person. What Voss did with them, he did through the cellar. The building's foundations sat on the partially collapsed cave system that the construction crew had filled with rubble in the 1870 seconds, and behind a stone wall in the back of the cellar there was a passage that opened into a vertical shaft, dropping straight down into the limestone. The shaft went maybe 15 feet before it opened into a natural chamber below. Voss knew about it because he had found it during his first year as superintendent, when he was inspecting the cellar foundation, and noticed a draft coming through the wall. He pulled out 2 stones and found the passage and the shaft and the dark below. The specifics of what happened in that cellar aren't known, and I won't invent them here. What is known is this. Between 1890 and 1897, at least 9 young people between 16 and 17 entered the Balsam County Workhouse, and not one of them was seen again by anyone outside its walls. The mountain took them, and the record said they had never been there, and for 7 years the limestone beneath the building kept what Voss gave it. In 7 years, no inspector visited the Balsam County Workhouse. Not once. The county sent quarterly funds, and Voss sent back receipts with a count of inmates, and the county filed the receipts and moved on to the next piece of business. The system worked because nobody checked it, and nobody checked it because the workhouse was 14 miles up a road that most county officials had no reason to travel. The people inside those walls were the people the county had decided it didn't want to see, and the county was consistent about that decision. It didn't look. Then in March of 1896, something happened in Washington that nobody in Balsam County knew about or would have cared about if they had. A fire in the Department of the Interior building badly damaged the 1890 census special schedules, the ones that recorded mortality, crime, pauperism, and benevolence, and special classes. The Department of the Interior ordered the damaged schedules destroyed. Among the schedules burned that month were the ones that would have documented poorhouse populations across the country, the records that listed who was in which institution, and when, and in what condition. The irony of this is sharp enough that you should sit with it for a moment. The federal government itself destroyed the backup records that might have caught what Voss was doing before anyone knew there was anything to catch. The schedules that could have shown discrepancy between the number of young people who entered the Balsam County Workhouse and the number the census recorded as being there. Those schedules were gone. Turned to ash on the order of a department clerk in Washington who had never heard of Balsam County and never would. Even if someone in the county had wanted to investigate, even if a sheriff or a county clerk had looked at the workhouse roster and felt that something didn't add up, the records to cross-reference were disappearing. The poorhouse existed in a gap between county memory and federal record, and that gap was getting wider every year. The county didn't check. The federal government burned the evidence. And the man on the limestone ridge kept his hands still at his sides, and his voice low, and his cellar door locked, and the mountain held what he put beneath it. For 7 years the arrangement held. Then the mountain moved. April of 1897 was a wet month in the southwest Virginia mountains. It rained for 11 days, straight at one point, the kind of steady, soaking rain that turns mountain roads into creeks and fills every depression in the ground with water that has nowhere to go. The limestone beneath the workhouse, absorbed what it could, and what it couldn't absorb, it moved through. The cave system, under the foundation, the one the builders had filled with rubble 20 years earlier, began to shift. The rubble settled, the floor above it. The stone floor of the cellar that had held since the 1870 began to crack. The hired hand who found it was Judson Creel, the same man who had been listed on the census schedule as a farmhand in 1890. He was 31 that spring, broad and dark-haired, and he had worked for Voss for 9 years, because the work was steady, and the pay came on time, and there wasn't much other work in Balsam County for a man without land. Creel went down into the cellar on a Wednesday morning to get jars from the root shelf, and noticed that the floor near the back wall had buckled. A section of stone roughly 4 feet across had cracked and dropped, and beneath it was a hole. The edges of the hole were clean, the kind of clean break that limestone makes when it gives way, and the hole opened straight down into dark. The smell that came up out of that hole was, in Creel's words to the county clerk later, the worst thing he had ever stood close to. He knew the smell of a dead animal from farm work, the thick sweet rot of a hog that had died in its pen, or a deer that had been left too long in the brush. This wasn't that smell. It was the accumulated smell of something that had been collecting in a closed space beneath a stone floor for years, and it filled the cellar in the time it took Creel to cross from the stairs to the hole. He went to Voss. He told him what he'd found. Voss looked at him with those deep-set eyes and told him to board over the hole and say nothing about it to anyone. He said the cellar floor had settled, that it happened with limestone, that there was nothing down there but old stone and water, and the smell was probably a dead raccoon that had fallen in through a crack. He said it calmly, the way he said everything, and his hands were still at his sides. Judson Creel did not board over the hole. Judson Creel saddled a horse and rode 14 miles to the county seat, and walked into the county clerk's office and told him what he'd found. He told him about the hole and the smell, and about the years he'd watched young people arrive at the workhouse and disappear from it, and the clerk listened and sent for the sheriff. The county sent 2 men. The sheriff was a man named Hollis Trumbo, 52 years old, gray-bearded, a farmer before he was a lawman, and he had been sheriff of Balsam County for 11 years and had never once visited the workhouse on the ridge. The county physician was Dr. Amos Farron, 40, lean, who had been a field surgeon during the war and had seen things in field hospitals that a man does not forget and does not describe unless he has to. They arrived at the workhouse 2 days after Creel's ride, carrying lanterns and rope and a medical bag. Voss met them at the gate. He was calm. He stood with his hands at his sides and his voice at its usual low pitch, and he told them that the cellar floor had settled, that it was a natural occurrence with limestone, that there was nothing down there but old stone and still water. He said the smell was from an animal. He said there was no reason for the county to be concerned. Trumbo looked at him and said nothing, and Farron said nothing, and they walked past him into the building and down the cellar stairs. The hole was where Creel had said it was, 4 feet across, clean-edged, opening straight down. Trumbo lowered a lantern on a rope. The light swung as it went down, throwing shadows against limestone walls that were wet and smooth and old. It dropped maybe 15 feet before the light steadied and the beam hit bottom. The bottom wasn't empty. Farron, who had been a field surgeon at Spotsylvania and had looked into burial pits filled with the bodies of men who had been dead for days in the summer heat, looked down into that shaft and told Sheriff Trumbo what he was seeing. He used the clinical word for it, the word a doctor uses when he's trying to keep his voice steady. What he saw was remains, not one set and not 2, but a layer of them, deposited over time, the way a pit fills when something is put into it regularly and covered and left and then added to again. The limestone had preserved what it could. The darkness and the dry air and the years had done the rest. They came back up the cellar stairs and into the daylight, and Trumbo looked at Voss, standing in the yard with his hands at his sides, and his face showing nothing, and the sheriff put his hand on his belt where his pistol hung, and said nothing, yet, because saying something required records, and records were what this story was about to run into. Trumbo arrested Voss that afternoon on a charge of unlawful burial, which was the closest charge available under Virginia law for what they'd found in the shaft. There was no charge for erasing someone from a census, because no one in the Virginia legal code had considered that a crime could be committed that way. Voss did not resist. He walked to the wagon and sat down and folded his hands in his lap, and said nothing. At the jail in the county seat, Voss sat in his cell and maintained his calm. He told Trumbo that the shaft was a natural cave, that the remains were old, that they predated the workhouse and had nothing to do with it. He said he had never put anything down there. He said the young people who had passed through the workhouse over the years had all been apprenticed out or sent home, and he had the paperwork to prove it. The paperwork was real, or it looked real. Voss produced commitment orders and release papers for most of the young inmates who had come through the workhouse. The papers were signed, some by judges, some by county clerks, some by Voss himself as superintendent. They documented arrivals and departures with dates and names, but several names had no release paper. Arlo Vance had no release paper. Voss told Trumbo that the boy had run off in the night, and that he hadn't thought it worth reporting, since the boy wasn't his responsibility, and the county had sent him without much paperwork to begin with. This was where the investigation turned from a question of what was in the ground to a question of what was on the page. Trumbo needed to prove that the young people had been at the workhouse, and the only document that would have recorded every person under that roof was the 1890 census. He sent a man to the county clerk's office to find it. The county clerk did not have it. The 1890 census originals had been sent to Washington, as the law required, and there was no local copy. Unlike every census before 1890, which had left duplicates in county clerks' offices across the country, the 11th census centralized everything in the capital. Wait. The county had no way to verify who had been counted at the workhouse, and who had not. The record that could have proven the erasure was sitting in a building in Washington, and Balsam County had no copy of its own. Trumbo wrote to the census office in Washington, requesting the schedule for the Balsam County Workhouse. He described the investigation and the charge, and asked specifically for the names of all persons recorded at that institution. The letter took 6 weeks to get a response, and when the response came, it was a transcription of the schedule. The schedule listed Harlan Voss, his wife Cora, 2 hired farmhands, and 11 elderly or disabled inmates. It did not list Arlo Vance. It did not list any of the other young people between 16 and 17 who had been at the workhouse in June of 1890. The enumerator, Ward Pell, had written down what Voss told him to write, and what he had not written was the names of the people Voss intended to make disappear. This was the moment when the shape of the crime became clear, and it was worse than anything Trumbo had imagined when he first looked down into that shaft. Voss hadn't just killed people and hidden them in the ground. He had erased them before he killed them. He had made sure the record never knew they were alive, so that when they were gone, there was nothing to look for and no one to ask for them. The census, the one document designed to count every person in the country, had been turned into a weapon. The enumerator's pen had done what the shaft in the cellar finished. Stop me here for a second, because there's something you need to understand about what this meant. The young people in that shaft were untraceable. They had no census record, and no family asking for them. The commitment orders that existed were incomplete, and the ones Voss produced were suspect. Without the census to prove they had been at the workhouse, the county couldn't prove they had been killed there. The erasure wasn't a side effect of the crime. The erasure was the crime. It was the mechanism that made everything else possible. Voss stayed in the county jail for 3 months while the investigation continued. He did not confess. He did not deny. He sat in his cell and ate what was brought to him, and spoke only when spoken to. And when he was spoken to, he said the shaft was a natural cave, and the remains were old, and he had nothing to do with any of it. His voice stayed at its low pitch, and his hands stayed still. Dr. Farron went back down into the shaft with 2 hired men and a rope and a lantern, and a medical bag, and he spent a day and a half in the chamber below the workhouse cellar. What he found he recorded in a report to the County Board of Supervisors. The report identified remains consistent with at least 9 individuals. He couldn't determine identity. The conditions in the chamber, the limestone and the dry air and the years, had preserved enough to count but not enough to name. There were no records to match against. The census said they had never been there. Farron noted in his report that the remains were small, consistent with persons in their late teens, between 16 and 18 years of age. He noted the deposition pattern. The layering that indicated the shaft had been used repeatedly over a period of years. He noted the depth and the geology and the access point through the cellar wall. He wrote the report in the clinical language of a man who had seen burial pits before and knew what he was looking at, and he submitted it to the county, and he did not write anything else about it for the rest of his life. The county grand jury met in the fall of 1897. Drumbo presented the case, the shaft, the remains, the census schedule with no young people on it, the commitment orders with gaps, the superintendent's story about apprenticeships that no farmer in the valley could confirm. The jury deliberated for half a day and declined to indict. The reason was the evidence. The remains were in a natural cave beneath a building built on limestone. The connection between the remains and the workhouse was strong but circumstantial. Voss's release papers, whether fabricated or not, provided an alternative explanation for each disappearance. The census, the one document that could have placed those young people inside those walls, listed no one under 18. The erasure protected the eraser. The system that Voss had used to make the young people disappear was the same system that now prevented anyone from proving they had existed. Voss was released. He didn't return to the workhouse. The county terminated his appointment, and he collected his belongings from the superintendent's quarters and rode east with his wife Cora, down the mountain and out of Balsam County, and the records of where he went after that aren't known. He did not stand trial. He did not answer for what was in the shaft. He walked out of the county the way the young people had walked in, carried by the system, and then released by it, and the system didn't follow him. Ord Pell, the enumerator, continued farming his land in the mountain district. He was never questioned about what he wrote or did not write on the census schedule, because no one in Balsam County understood that the census had been the crime scene until after the grand jury had already declined to indict. Pell died in 1912 at the age of 62 and was buried in the churchyard at Balsam Creek. His census schedule, the one with 6 names missing, sat in a building in Washington. On the 10th of January 1921, a fire started in the basement of the Commerce Department building in Washington. A building fireman named James Foster noticed smoke coming through pipe openings from the boiler room at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and by the time the fire department arrived, the basement was filled with dense smoke. The 1890 census schedules were stacked on pine shelves in an unlocked file room outside the vault, and they were, in the words of a report, filed later, first in the path of the fireman. The fire was extinguished by nightfall, but the damage was done. 25% of the 1890 population schedules were destroyed outright. 50% of what remained was damaged by water, smoke, and fire. The census director estimated that the records were certain to be absolutely ruined, that there was no method of restoring the legibility of a water-soaked volume. The schedules were moved to temporary storage, and over the following months, they deteriorated further. In December of 1932, the Bureau of the Census sent a list of papers no longer necessary for current business to the Librarian of Congress. Item 22 on the list read, Schedules, Population, 1890, original. The librarian identified no records as worth keeping, and Congress authorized destruction on the 21st of February 1933. The remaining 1890 census schedules were destroyed. What the fire didn't take, the government finished. What this means for the story of the Balsam County Workhouse is simple and permanent. The census schedule that Ward Pell filled out, the one that listed 11 elderly inmates and no young people, is gone. It no longer exists. There's no way to look at it and see what Pell wrote and what he left blank. There's no way to compare it to the workhouse records. There's no way to prove the erasure happened. The only surviving fragments of the 1890 census come from a handful of states, and Virginia isn't among them. The records for Balsam County, for the workhouse on the Limestone Ridge, for the 6 young people whose names were never written down, all of it is ash. Arlo Vance, 17 years old, dark hair, a scar across his left palm from a knife slip at a sawmill, exists nowhere in the federal record of the United States. He was never counted and never written down. He arrived at a workhouse in the Virginia mountains in the spring of 1889, and he was never seen again, and the archive doesn't know he was alive. The shaft beneath the Balsam County Workhouse was sealed with concrete in 1898, a year after the discovery. The county ordered it done, and a crew of men carried bags of cement up the mountain and poured them into the hole in the cellar floor until the opening was closed and the smell stopped. The building was abandoned in 1903 when the county consolidated its poor relief into a regional facility down in the valley, and the stone walls of the workhouse were left to the weather, and the kudzu, and the slow patience of the mountains. The mountain kept the bones, the government burned the names. That's the arrangement, and there's nothing to be done about it now. If you're still with me, and I hope you are, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. The town, the country, the road if there's no town. I read every one of them. And if you want more stories like this one, stories the record tried to bury, the Appalachian dossier is linked in the description and the pinned comment. Go see what else they tried to erase. The concrete in the cellar of the Balsam County Workhouse is still there. The limestone is still there. What is beneath it, no one has gone to see.